The morning fog clung to the grounds of Kensington Palace like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the city beyond its gates. William stood at the tall windows of their private quarters, his hands pressed against the cool glass as he watched the world wake up outside. The familiar routine of palace life continued below. Gardeners tending to the roses, security making their rounds, staff preparing for another day of royal duties. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of finality. Kate moved quietly behind him, her bare feet silent on the polished wooden floors. She had been awake for hours, unable to find peace and sleep when their time together was running short. The silk curtains caught the early light, casting gentle shadows across the room they had shared for so many years. Every corner held memories. The reading chair where she would curl up with her morning tea, the desk where William would review his speeches, the photographs that told the story of their life together. "The children are still sleeping," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. William turned slowly, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the burden of what lay ahead. They had talked through the night, making plans and promises they both hoped they could keep. But words felt inadequate now, insufficient to bridge the growing distance between their current life and the unknown future. The decision had been months in the making. Though they had avoided speaking about it directly until recently, the pressures of royal life, the constant scrutiny, the weight of expectations, it had all become too much. Not for their love, which remained as strong as ever, but for their sanity, their privacy, their ability to raise their children in something resembling normalcy. They had tried to make it work, tried to find balance within the constraints of duty and tradition. William reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together. Her wedding ring caught the light, a simple band that represented so much more than gold and promises. They had stood before the world once, declaring their love in front of millions, believing they could weather any storm together. And they had weathered many. Scandals, loss, criticism, pressure that would have broken lesser bonds. "Do you remember our first morning here?" William asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Kate smiled despite the heaviness in her heart. They had been so young then, so full of hope and determination to change things from within. They had believed they could modernize the monarchy, make it more accessible, more human. In many ways, they had succeeded, but the cost had been higher than either had anticipated. The sound of small footsteps in the hallway reminded them that their children would wake soon, full of questions they weren't quite ready to answer. George, Charlotte, and Louis deserved stability, deserved parents who weren't constantly torn between public duty and private desires. The decision to step back hadn't been made lightly. It represented a fundamental shift in everything they had known, everything they had been trained for since childhood. Kate moved to the wardrobe, her fingers lingering over the formal gowns and suits that had defined their public appearances. Each piece of clothing held memories of state dinners, charity galas, official visits to far-flung corners of the Commonwealth. She pulled out a simple blue dress, something she might wear for a private family outing, and laid it carefully on the bed. Today would not be about crowns or ceremony. It would be about being human. The palace staff had been informed of their decision the previous evening, and Kate could only imagine the conversations happening in the kitchens and corridors below. Some would understand, perhaps even admire their courage. Others would see it as abandonment, a betrayal of duty and tradition. The press would have a field day, dissecting every aspect of their choice, speculating about motives and consequences. But as William joined her by the bed, as they stood together in the quiet of their room with the morning light growing stronger, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Fear, yes, but also excitement about what lay beyond the palace walls. They would face criticism, lose titles, disappoint people who had believed in them, but they would also gain something precious, the freedom to choose their own path. The clock on the mantel chimed 7, and they could hear their children stirring in the adjacent rooms. Soon there would be breakfast, explanations, tears perhaps, but also hope. They had taught their children about duty and service, but they had also taught them about love and sacrifice. Today would be a lesson in both. The sacrifice of position for the love of family, the duty to oneself as much as to country. William straightened his shoulders, and Kate saw in his posture the prince he had been trained to be, but also the man he had chosen to become. Their last morning in Kensington Palace was ending, But their first morning as a family choosing their own destiny was about to begin. The breakfast room felt smaller than usual as the family gathered around the familiar oak table. George sat in his usual spot, unconsciously straightening his school tie the way his father had taught him. Charlotte arranged her napkin with the precision of someone who had attended countless formal meals, while Louis swung his legs from his chair, blissfully unaware that this morning was different from all the others that had come before. Kate poured orange juice into small glasses, her movements automatic after years of similar mornings, but her hands trembled slightly and William noticed, reaching across to steady the pitcher with his own hand. Their eyes met over the children's heads, a silent communication that had developed over years of navigating difficult conversations and public appearances together. "Mummy, why do you look sad?" Charlotte asked, her young voice cutting through the careful atmosphere her parents had tried to create. She had always been perceptive, reading emotions in faces the way other children read picture books. Kate sat down beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair away from Charlotte's face with infinite tenderness. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions," Kate began, choosing her words carefully. "Your father and I need to talk to you about something important." George looked up from his cereal, suddenly alert. At his age, he understood more about their public life, the expectations placed upon them, the cameras that followed their every move. William cleared his throat, the same nervous gesture he had made before proposing to Kate all those years ago. "We've decided that our family needs a change," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was sharing. "We're going to step back from our royal duties and live more quietly." The silence that followed was deafening. Louis continued eating, but George's spoon hovered halfway to his mouth and Charlotte's eyes widened with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been relief. These children had grown up in the spotlight, their every milestone documented and analyzed, their childhood structured around obligations they had never chosen. "Does that mean no more boring ceremonies?" Louis asked innocently, and despite everything, William and Kate both smiled. Their youngest had never hidden his impatience with the formal events that punctuated their lives, the long periods of standing still while adults made speeches about things that meant nothing to a 6-year-old. "It means we can choose what we want to do," Kate explained gently. "We can travel places because we want to see them, not because we have to. We can have friends over without checking with protocol officers. We can be normal." The word hung in the air like a promise none of them had dared to make before. George set down his spoon completely, his young face serious beyond his years. "Will people be angry with us?" he asked, and the question broke William's heart because no child should have to worry about public opinion before breakfast. But George had lived his entire life knowing that cameras might be watching, that his behavior reflected on something larger than himself. "Some people might not understand," William admitted, refusing to lie to his son, "but the people who love us will support our decision. And sometimes doing what's right for your family is more important than what other people think." It was a lesson he wished he had learned earlier, before years of trying to balance impossible expectations had worn them all down. Charlotte slipped from her chair and climbed into Kate's lap, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of her mother's embrace. "Will we still live here?" she asked, looking around the breakfast room with its formal portraits and crystal chandelier. This palace was the only home she had ever known, but Kate could see in her daughter's eyes that it had never felt quite like home, more like a beautiful museum where they happened to sleep. "We're going to find a new house," Kate said, smoothing Charlotte's hair. "Somewhere with a big garden where you can run and play without worrying about photographers. Somewhere we can have barbecues and movie nights and lazy Sunday mornings." The vision she painted was simple, ordinary, and utterly appealing to children who had lived their lives under constant observation. The kitchen staff had prepared their favorite breakfast foods, fresh scones, local honey, perfectly brewed tea, but nobody seemed particularly hungry anymore. The magnitude of their decision was sinking in, not just for William and Kate, but for their children who would have to navigate this change alongside them. "What about Grandmama?" George asked quietly, referring to the Queen. William's relationship with his grandmother had always been complex, built on love but constrained by duty and tradition. This decision would disappoint her, perhaps anger her, but he hoped she would eventually understand that he was protecting his family the only way he knew how. "Grandmama loves us," William said carefully. "She might not agree with our choice, but she wants us to be happy. Sometimes love means letting people go, even when it's hard. The words applied as much to their relationship with the monarchy as to family dynamics, and he suspected that his children, young as they were, understood more than they let on. As breakfast drew to a close, the children scattered to gather their belongings, their young voices echoing through the corridors as they discussed this new development, with the adaptability that children possess. William and Kate remained at the table, surrounded by the remnants of their last family meal in Kensington Palace, both of them acutely aware that they had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The telephone call came at precisely 11:30, just as Kate had known it would. She watched William's face as he answered, saw his jaw tighten and his free hand clench into a fist. The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, and completely predictable in its outrage. Palace officials had been working through the night, she knew, trying to craft damage control strategies for a situation they had never anticipated. "Yes, sir, I understand your concerns," William said into the receiver, his voice maintaining the careful politeness that had been drilled into him since childhood. But Kate could see the rebellion building in his eyes, the same look that had appeared when he had first told his father he wanted to marry a commoner, when he had insisted on military service despite security concerns, when he had pushed for modernization of outdated protocols. The children were in the garden with their protection officers, who had been briefed about the family's decision, but instructed to maintain normal routines until official announcements could be made. Through the window, Kate could see George teaching Louis how to kick a football properly while Charlotte practiced cartwheels on the lawn. They looked so normal, so wonderfully ordinary, and it strengthened her resolve. "The decision has been made," William said firmly into the phone, cutting off what sounded like a lengthy lecture about duty and precedent. "We've thought about this carefully, and we believe it's what's best for our family." There was more shouting from the other end, and Kate moved closer to her husband, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. When he finally hung up, William looked older than his years. The weight of disappointing people he loved, people who had invested so much in his future as a working royal, was evident in every line of his face. But there was also relief there, the kind that comes from finally speaking truth instead of diplomatically navigating around it. "They want us to reconsider," he said unnecessarily. Kate nodded, having expected nothing less. The monarchy was an institution built on stability and continuity, and their decision represented a fundamental challenge to both. They're offering compromises, fewer engagements, more private time, better security arrangements for the children. "And in return?" Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. "There would be strings attached to any compromise, conditions that would gradually erode whatever freedom they managed to gain." She had watched other royals make similar deals, trading pieces of their independence for the promise of a slightly easier life that never quite materialized. "In return, we stay. We continue representing the crown, continue attending state functions, continue raising our children as working royals." William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that would have been corrected by protocol officers in any public setting. "They don't understand that this isn't about wanting an easier life. It's about wanting our own life." The distinction was crucial, and Kate was grateful that William could articulate it so clearly. This wasn't about avoiding responsibility or seeking comfort. It was about choosing which responsibilities to accept and which dreams to pursue. They had given years of service, attended thousands of events, supported hundreds of charities, but they had never been able to simply exist without the weight of royal expectations shaping every decision. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Kate's private secretary entered, carrying a tablet displaying the morning's news coverage. "Ma'am, the story has broken," she said quietly, her expression carefully neutral. "The palace issued a statement, but the speculation has already begun." Kate took the tablet, scrolling through headlines that ranged from sympathetic to scathing. Some outlets praised their courage, comparing their decision to other royals who had chosen love over duty. Others condemned them as selfish, abandoning their obligations at a time when the monarchy needed stability. The comment sections were particularly brutal, filled with opinions from people who felt personally betrayed by their choice. "Look at this one," William said, reading over her shoulder. A respected royal correspondent had written a thoughtful piece about the pressures facing modern royals, the impossible balance between public service and private happiness. At least someone understands that this wasn't an easy decision. But for every understanding voice, there were 10 others expressing anger, disappointment, or smug satisfaction at watching privileged people face consequences. Kate had expected this reaction, had steeled herself for it during the long nights of planning and discussion. What surprised her was how little it hurt now that the moment had arrived. The opinions of strangers seemed less important when measured against the laughter of her children in the garden. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors, senior palace officials, family members, trusted friends who wanted to understand the decision or attempt to change their minds. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: shock, attempts at persuasion, gradual acceptance that William and Kate had made an irreversible choice. Kate's mother arrived with tears in her eyes and a fierce hug that conveyed both pride and worry. "I know this wasn't easy," she whispered, "but I also know you wouldn't have done it unless you were certain." The support of her family meant everything to Kate, a reminder that love existed outside the confines of royal duty. By evening, the formal processes had begun. Lawyers discussed titles and privileges, financial arrangements, and security considerations. The children would retain their places in the line of succession, but would be raised as private citizens. William and Kate would lose their HRH styles, their patronages, their roles in state ceremonies. On paper, it looked like an enormous loss. In reality, it felt like freedom. As the day drew to a close, William and Kate found themselves back in their private quarters, surrounded by the chaos of packing and planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new adjustments. But tonight, they were still a family making a brave choice together, and that felt like enough. The moving trucks arrived before dawn, their presence transforming the quiet dignity of Kensington Palace into something resembling organized chaos. Kate stood in what had once been her dressing room, now empty except for the built-in wardrobes and the morning light streaming through windows she would never look through again. The removal team worked with professional efficiency, wrapping personal belongings in protective paper and loading them into boxes labeled simply Cambridge, a surname that would soon be just a family name, rather than a working title. William supervised the packing of his study, watching as years of correspondence, speeches, and official documents were sorted into different categories. Some would go with them to their new life. Others would remain in palace archives, and still others would be returned to the institutions that had originally provided them. The process felt archaeological, like excavating layers of a life that had been both deeply personal and utterly public. The children moved through the palace like explorers, rediscovering corners and rooms they rarely visited, saying goodbye to spaces that had shaped their earliest memories. Charlotte found her first pair of ballet shoes in a forgotten corner of the nursery, while George discovered a collection of toy soldiers he had abandoned years ago. Louis, too young to fully understand the permanence of their departure, treated the day like an adventure, delighting in the bubble wrap and empty boxes. Kate's dresser, Maria, had been with the family since before the children were born. She folded clothes with the care of someone who understood that each garment held memories. The dress Kate had worn to George's first school play, the coat that had seen countless charitable visits, the comfortable sweaters reserved for private family moments. "Will you miss it, ma'am?" Maria asked quietly, gesturing toward the formal gowns being carefully wrapped for storage. "Parts of it," Kate answered honestly. She would miss the ability to bring attention to causes she cared about, the platform that royal status provided for charitable work. But she wouldn't miss the constraints, the constant scrutiny, the feeling that every moment was being evaluated and judged by people who had never lived under such pressure. A delegation of staff gathered in the main hallway as the morning progressed. People who had served the family faithfully for years and now faced an uncertain future. Some would be reassigned to other royal households. Others would receive generous severance packages, and a few had chosen to follow William and Kate into their private life. The goodbye speeches were brief but emotional, filled with gratitude and genuine affection. "You've been more than employees," William told the assembled group. "You've been friends, confidants, and family. The decision to leave has nothing to do with you and everything to do with our need to find a different path." His voice carried the weight of genuine regret for the disruption their choice had caused in so many lives. Shiu. Hardest goodbye came from an unexpected source. William's protection officer, James, had been with him for over a decade, witnessing both triumphant public moments and private struggles. He would not be accompanying them to their new life. Private security would be handled differently, less intensively, with more emphasis on blending in than standing out. "It's been an honor, sir," James said simply, his formal words inadequate to express years of mutual respect and trust. They shook hands like old friends because that's what they had become despite the professional boundaries that were supposed to define their relationship. By noon, the private quarters were empty except for furniture that would remain for the next occupants. The family gathered in the drawing room where they had spent countless evenings together, where Christmas mornings had unfolded with gift exchanges and laughter, where difficult conversations had been navigated with patience and love. The room felt cavernous without their personal belongings, like a stage set waiting for new actors. Kate's phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family members, and colleagues expressing support, concern, or simple curiosity about their decision. She had turned off social media notifications days ago, unable to cope with the constant stream of opinions from strangers who felt entitled to judge their choices. But the personal messages meant everything, reminders that their worth wasn't tied to their titles or their public roles. An official car waited in the courtyard, surrounded by the subtle but unmistakable presence of security personnel and media management staff. This would be their last official departure from Kensington Palace, their final moment as working royals. Tomorrow they would leave again, but as private citizens in a modest family car, heading toward a future they were creating for themselves. The children seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They moved more quietly through the familiar corridors, their footsteps echoing in spaces that suddenly felt too large and too formal. Charlotte reached for Kate's hand as they walked, while George stayed close to his father, unconsciously mimicking William's straight-backed posture. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Louis asked as they made their final circuit through the rooms that had housed their family life. William considered the question seriously, recognizing that his youngest son deserved an honest answer rather than false reassurance. "A little," William admitted, "but I'm also excited. Sometimes the best things happen when, we're brave enough to try something new." It was a lesson he hoped his children would remember throughout their lives, that security and happiness weren't always the same thing, and that choosing the unknown over the comfortable could lead to extraordinary discoveries. As they prepared to leave for their final official engagement, Kate took one last look around the entrance hall where she had first walked as a new bride, nervous and hopeful about the life stretching ahead of her. That young woman could never have imagined this moment, this choice, this particular kind of courage. But she wouldn't change the journey that had led them here, because it had taught them who they really were beneath all the titles and expectations. The final engagement was deliberately small and meaningful, a visit to a children's hospice that Kate had supported for years, far from the grand ceremonial venues that usually hosted royal farewells. The staff and families gathered there knew nothing of the drama unfolding in palaces and newspaper offices. They simply welcomed the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge as they had many times before, with genuine warmth and gratitude for attention brought to their cause. Kate knelt beside a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who was painting a picture of butterflies with shaky but determined hands. "They're beautiful," Kate said softly, admiring the bright colors that covered most of the paper and some of Emma's fingers as well. The little girl beamed with pride, unaware that this moment of pure joy was exactly what Kate needed to remember why stepping away felt right. William sat in a circle with teenage patients, listening to their stories and dreams with the patience that had always made him effective in these settings. These young people faced challenges that made royal protocol seem trivial by comparison, and their courage reminded him why he had always preferred grassroots charitable work to ceremonial duties. They talked about normal teenage things, music, school, friendships, with an intensity that came from knowing how precious ordinary moments could be. The hospice director, Sarah, had worked with Kate for 3 years and had grown to appreciate her genuine commitment beyond the publicity value of royal patronage. "This isn't really goodbye, is it?" Sarah asked quietly as they watched William help a young boy with his physiotherapy exercises. Kate's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back all day. "I hope not," Kate replied. "The titles might change, but the caring doesn't stop." She meant it sincerely, though she knew that charitable work without royal status would be different, smaller in scale perhaps, but potentially more personal and direct. There would be no red carpets or formal presentations, but there might be more authentic connections with the people she wanted to help. The visit lasted 2 hours, longer than originally scheduled because neither William nor Kate wanted it to end. These moments of genuine human connection had always been the most rewarding part of their royal duties, and letting go of them felt like the greatest sacrifice their decision required. But they also recognized that stepping back might allow them to help in different ways, without the constraints and complications that came with official roles. As they prepared to leave, Emma pressed her butterfly painting into Kate's hands. "For when you're sad," the little girl said with the wisdom that serious illness sometimes brings to children. Kate hugged her carefully, breathing in the scent of poster paint and innocence, storing the memory for the difficult days she knew lay ahead. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts about what they were leaving behind and what they were moving toward. The children had handled the day with remarkable grace, understanding somehow that this wasn't an ending, but a transformation. They asked practical questions about their new house, their new school, their new life, treating the change as an adventure rather than a loss. Back at the palace, the final boxes were being loaded into removal trucks while a small group of reporters gathered at the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the family on their last day as working royals. The media attention felt different now, less reverential, more speculative, tinged with the disappointment of those who felt personally let down by their decision. Kate's parents arrived to help with the transition, bringing normalcy and emotional support when both were desperately needed. They had watched their daughter navigate the complexities of royal life for over a decade, celebrating her successes and worrying about the toll it took on her happiness. Now they offered practical help and unconditional love as she embarked on something entirely new. "You're doing the right thing," Kate's father said quietly as they supervised the loading of the last boxes. "I've watched you both give everything to this role, and sometimes everything isn't sustainable." His words carried the weight of a parent who had seen his child struggle with impossible expectations and choose courage over comfort. Dinner that evening was takeaway. Chinese food eaten from paper containers in the empty kitchen, a deliciously ordinary meal in supremely unusual circumstances. The children giggled at the novelty of eating from cartons while sitting on the floor, while William and Kate marveled at how normal it felt to make such a simple decision without consulting protocol officers or dietary advisors. "I like this," Charlotte announced, brandishing a pair of chopsticks with limited success. "Can we do this in our new house?" The question made both parents smile, a reminder that their children were already adapting to the idea of increased informality and decreased supervision. As night fell, they walked through the palace one final time, turning off lights and checking locks like any family leaving home for the last time. The building felt different without their personal belongings, grander but also emptier, like a beautiful museum rather than a home. Tomorrow it would be occupied by new staff, new purposes, new stories, but tonight it held only memories and moonlight. The children fell asleep easily, exhausted by the emotions and changes of the day. William and Kate sat in their bedroom, surrounded by suitcases and the few personal items they would take with them in the morning. They talked about practical things, school enrollment, security arrangements, the mundane details of building a life outside institutional support, but underneath the logistics lay deeper questions about identity, purpose, and what it meant to choose love over duty in a world that often demanded the opposite. They had spent years being told who they were and what they represented, and now they had the opportunity to discover who they might become when freed from those definitions. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that they had learned to fly. Dawn came too early and not soon enough. Kate woke to find William already dressed, standing at the window watching the sunrise paint the palace gardens in shades of gold and amber. This view had been theirs for so many years, marking countless mornings of duty and dedication, celebration and sorrow. Today would be the last time they witnessed it as residents rather than visitors. "Second thoughts?" Kate asked softly, joining him at the window. Her question was gentle but genuine. Even at this late stage, she would understand if he needed to reconsider. The weight of disappointing his family, his country, the institution he had been raised to serve was enormous, and she had watched him wrestle with it throughout their months of planning. "Not about the decision," William replied, slipping his arm around her waist. but about whether we're strong enough for what comes next. The admission was honest and vulnerable, acknowledging that stepping away from royal life meant losing not just privilege, but also the structure and support system that had defined their existence. The children woke slowly, emerging from their rooms with the sleepy confusion of those whose familiar world had been transformed overnight. Their belongings were packed, their routines disrupted, their future uncertain in ways that even the most well-adjusted children would find unsettling. But they gathered for breakfast with remarkable resilience, treating the day as an adventure rather than a crisis. Kate's phone had been switched off since the previous evening, but William still buzzed with calls from palace officials, family members, and journalists seeking final comments or attempting last-minute interventions. He ignored them all, focusing instead on buttering toast for Louis and listening to Charlotte's excited chatter about their new house. The removal trucks had departed during the night, carrying their personal belongings to a modest country house 2 hours outside London. It was a property William had inherited from his great-grandmother, largely forgotten and unused for decades, but perfect for a family seeking privacy and normalcy. The children had seen photographs but hadn't yet visited, adding to the sense of adventure surrounding their departure. Their new life would be dramatically different in almost every way. No protocol officers to manage their schedules, no dresser to select appropriate outfits, no chef to prepare meals according to nutritional guidelines established by palace staff. They would shop for groceries, attend parent-teacher conferences, sit in traffic like any other family navigating the complexities of modern life. Kate had already enrolled the children in a local state school, a decision that had required careful negotiation with security advisors who worried about protection in less controlled environments. But both parents were determined that their children should experience education alongside peers from diverse backgrounds, learning about the world through direct experience rather than carefully curated royal visits. The final departure was scheduled for 10 in the morning, after the household staff had completed their duties, and before the changing of the guard that would mark the palace's transition to purely ceremonial function. William and Kate had chosen to leave quietly, without fanfare or formal statements, preferring dignity to drama in their final moments as working royals. As they gathered their remaining personal items, Kate discovered a letter that had been slipped under their door during the night. The envelope bore the familiar handwriting of William's grandmother, the Queen, and both of them stared at it for several moments before William carefully opened it. The message inside was brief but profound, expressing disappointment but also understanding love despite disagreement, and hope for their happiness in whatever form it might take. "She wishes us well," William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The Queen's blessing, however reluctant, meant more to him than he had expected. It suggested that while his choice might be seen as betrayal by some, it could also be understood as love by those who mattered. Most the children said goodbye to their protection officers with the casual affection of those too, young to understand how unusual such relationships really were. James gave each child a small gift: books for George and Charlotte, a toy soldier for Louis, tokens of years spent keeping them safe while trying to give them space to be children. At precisely 10 o'clock, they walked out of Kensington Palace for the last time as residents. No red carpet marked their path, no officials lined up to bid them farewell, no cameras recorded their departure for posterity. They simply left, carrying suitcases and holding hands, looking like any family moving to a new home rather than former royals abandoning centuries of tradition. The car that waited for them was ordinary, a family vehicle rather than an official state car, with child seats in the back and a few toys scattered on the floor. William loaded their suitcases into the boot, while Kate helped the children buckle their seatbelts, mundane actions that felt revolutionary after years of having such tasks handled by staff. As they drove through the palace gates, Kate caught a final glimpse of the building that had housed their official life. Sunlight caught the windows of their former apartment, making them gleam like diamonds, beautiful and untouchable. She felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief, nostalgia and anticipation, loss and liberation. The children pressed their faces to the windows, watching London scroll past as they left their old life behind. They passed landmarks they had visited officially, neighborhoods they had toured as part of their charitable work, streets they had traveled countless times in motorcades surrounded by security and ceremony. Today they were just another family in traffic, invisible and ordinary, and it felt like a gift. Their new house waited 90 minutes away, surrounded by fields and forests, far from photographers and protocol. It promised quiet mornings and spontaneous decisions, privacy and possibility. As they settled in for the drive, William reached across to take Kate's hand, and she squeezed back with all the love and courage she could summon for the journey ahead. The country house appeared around a bend in the narrow lane like something from a fairy tale, its honey-colored stone walls warming in the afternoon sun, and climbing roses framing windows that sparkled with promise. It was smaller than Kensington Palace, older than their London apartment, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. The garden was overgrown in places, the gravel drive needed attention, and several shutters hung at angles that would have horrified palace maintenance staff. "It's beautiful," Charlotte breathed, pressing her face against the car window as they approached. The property had belonged to William's great-grandmother, a spirited woman who had chosen love over royal duty decades earlier, making it somehow fitting that it should shelter another generation making similar choices. The house had waited patiently through years of neglect, and now it would ring with children's laughter again. They parked in front of the main entrance, where no footman waited to open doors or collect luggage. Instead, they climbed out themselves, stretching legs cramped from the journey and breathing deeply of country air that smelled of grass and freedom. Louis immediately ran toward a massive oak tree that dominated the front garden, while George and Charlotte explored the stone steps leading to a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. The removal trucks had arrived hours earlier, and boxes labeled with their former titles were stacked in rooms throughout the house. But unpacking could wait. First, they needed to explore their new kingdom, to claim these spaces as their own through the simple act of walking through them together. Every room revealed new possibilities, from the library where William could write without interruption to the conservatory, where Kate could grow herbs and vegetables. The kitchen was larger than expected, but clearly hadn't been updated in decades, with an ancient range cooker and a farmhouse sink deep enough to bathe a small child. Kate ran her fingers along the wooden countertops, imagining morning coffee and homework supervision, birthday cakes and holiday preparations. This room would be the heart of their new life, informal and welcoming in ways that palace kitchens could never be. Upstairs, the children claimed their bedrooms with the enthusiasm of explorers discovering new continents. Charlotte chose a room with windows overlooking the rose garden, while George preferred one with views across fields where sheep grazed peacefully. Louis wanted to share with his parents until he felt brave enough for his own space, a request that would have been impossible in their former life, but was easily accommodated here. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they began the process of transforming a house into a home. William assembled furniture while Kate unpacked clothes, both of them marveling at the novelty of doing such tasks themselves. The children helped by playing in empty boxes and asking endless questions about their new life. Their resilience and adaptability, a constant source of amazement to their parents. The first challenge came at dinner time when they realized that their new life would require skills they had never developed. Kate stared at the ancient range cooker with the same expression she had once reserved for state dining protocol, while William attempted to light the gas with matches that seemed determined to break. Eventually, they managed to heat soup and make sandwiches, a simple meal that tasted better than many elaborate palace dinners. They ate at a scrubbed pine table in the kitchen, candlelight flickering across their faces as darkness fell outside. The silence was profound after years of living surrounded by traffic and crowds, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant lowing of cattle. It was the sound of peace, of possibility, of a life lived according to their own rhythms rather than ceremonial schedules. "I like it here," Louis announced, his face smeared with soup and his eyes bright with excitement. "Can we get a dog?" The question sparked animated discussion about pets and responsibilities, normal family conversations that would have been complicated by security concerns and protocol requirements in their former life. After dinner, they gathered in the sitting room where a fire crackled in the grate and soft lamplight created pools of warmth in the gathering darkness. The children sprawled on the carpet with books while William and Kate shared the sofa, her head on his shoulder as they watched their family settle into this new space with remarkable ease. Their phones, switched back on for the first time all day, buzzed with messages from around the world. Some were supportive, others critical, many simply curious about their next steps. But in the warm circle of lamplight with their children's quiet voices reading aloud, the outside world seemed very far away and much less important than it had ever seemed before. Kate looked around the room, at William reading with Charlotte, at George helping Louis with difficult words, at the boxes still waiting to be unpacked and the life still waiting to be built, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, because happiness suggested a temporary emotion, but contentment, peace, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. Outside, night settled over the countryside with a completeness impossible in the city. No streetlights penetrated the darkness, no traffic disturbed the quiet, no photographers lurked beyond the garden walls. They were alone in the best possible way, free to be themselves without performance or pretense. As they prepared for bed in rooms that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, Kate stood at her bedroom window looking out at stars visible for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: school enrollment, grocery shopping, the 1,000 mundane tasks of ordinary life. But tonight, they were simply a family who had chosen love over duty, privacy over privilege, authenticity over expectation. William joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist as they looked out at their new world together. Behind them, their children's voices drifted from bedrooms where they were settling into sleep in a house that was already becoming home. They had given up titles and traditions, palaces and protocols, but they had gained something infinitely more precious: the freedom to write their own story, to choose their own path, to love without condition or compromise. Their last look back at royal life was finally complete, and their first look forward at whatever came next was just beginning.